beautiful.
Hello, lovers of the world. This is Sinta speaking. I love Agatha Christie. She is for sure my favorite writer of all time, and one of my favorite pastimes in the summer is diving back into her bibliography. I did not plan for this video to be the first video I post after my surprise hiatus, but I just wanted something nice and easy. Unlike my Poirot project, where I take great care in making the videos the best that it could be, I'm not as particular about Miss Marple. In fact, I don't think I've read a lot of her books actually. I've just never gravitated towards her books in the same way that I have with Hercule Poirot. Miss Marple's stories tend to be set in sleepy English villages, and the way she navigates them doesn't interest me as much as when I observe Hercule Poirot navigating other kinds of settings. Or that Miss Marple's deductions never have the same flair as Poirot's does. Thank you so much for bearing with me on my extended hiatus. Welcome back to the channel, especially a warm welcome to my new book club series where I pursue a discussion about the books that I've read, and you are welcome to participate in the comments if you so wish. This is less of a review and more like a brain dump of all the thoughts and feelings I had about books or a book that I've read recently, an outlet for me to express my opinions and my critical analysis, and as an exercise in my critical analysis skills. So I kind of approach these videos and expect the viewer to have already read the books that I'm talking about, because I don't really hold back on spoilers, especially with these kinds of books that are about murder mysteries. If you are a person who likes to not be spoiled on these kinds of things, I wouldn't recommend watching these videos, but I will put timestamps in the description to indicate when and where I'll talk about a specific book if you want to skip over certain parts and stuff. For this video, I will be talking about 5 Miss Marple books that I've read recently. So the first I've read is Sleeping Murder, then I read The Moving Finger, then I read 450 from Paddington, and then I read A Caribbean Mystery, and lastly I read Nemesis. And then towards the end, after I've kind of brain dumped all of my thoughts and feelings about each book, I will try to kind of tie stuff together, see if there's any themes that I noticed or observed, or if there was anything that can kind of give shape or give like a coherent or cohesive conclusion to the video. Because I'm such a big Agatha Christie fan, I've actually already read a lot of these books in the past or have seen adaptations of it when I was younger. So a lot of them I already have a vague idea, or I remember the ending. So when I read these books, I was more so intending to see how well they hold up in a reread, because I believe that, you know, a good murder mystery shouldn't rely entirely on the solution. You should be able to enjoy the book on a second reread, even if you already know who the person did it. Kind of seeing whether or not I'm still entertained by the characters, the prose, the B-plots, or the writing styles or techniques that have been utilized. So without further ado, let's go to the first book I read, which is Sleeping Murder. The protagonist for Sleeping Murder is a young woman named Gwenda who grew up in New Zealand but is a British citizen. Funnily enough, I live in New Zealand. Gwenda was recently married and she flew to New Zealand ahead of her husband to find a house for both of them to live in. She comes across this house, she immediately likes it and therefore buys it on the spot. Throughout the construction or renovation process, she experiences these random flashes of deja vu, and she finds this really weird because she's actually never lived in England before. This is the first time supposedly that she's been in the country, and it all kind of comes to a head when one day she triggered episode and realizes that she has actually lived in the same house when she was young, and nobody told her that she lived in England for such a short amount of time. And when she was a child, she witnessed a murder happening there, and that's what triggered her episode. That woman, or that person that she saw killed in her memories, turned out to be her young stepmother named Helen. So I watched an adaptation of this a long time ago and I remembered the ending very vaguely, so I was mostly curious how this book would set up that final reveal. Overall, I thought the book was very cleverly constructed. The murderer turned out to be Helen's older half-brother, and he killed her. I can't remember his name. And he killed her because he was obsessed with Helen. The implications of him being the murderer and his motives are pretty disturbing. A plot that I've actually never encountered before this, so it's kind of like, So it's quite jarring. My thoughts on this is that it's quite weird to see Miss Marple actually actively deter the young couple from finding out the truth. I don't know if I can, for example, necessarily see Hercule Poirot doing the same thing if he noticed somebody kind of experiencing a similar or having a same reaction. And I think it's a testament definitely to Agatha Christie's writing skills that she can expertly delineate her characters in such a significant way. Poirot has expressed a similar viewpoint about justice and life in the sense that life is for the living and the future is all that matters. So it's best to put focus on the present and not worry too much about people who have already died. That's a sentiment I've definitely seen before. But Miss Marple in this book is so actively dissuading Gwenda and her husband Giles from finding out the truth. And it's very interesting because with murder mysteries like these, you kind of take for granted that, like, yeah, justice has to be served. You have to find out who did it. It's an interesting experience for the sleuth of the whodunit to be the one that's like, no, you don't want to know the truth. It can kind of upset you, or it can overturn your life, or it will change things in a way that you didn't really expect. But I feel like reading through it, that not enough gravity is really given to Helen's death, and it's only Gwenda who seems to be really motivated in honoring her passing and finding out who her killer was and understanding the truth. And I understand that the people involved in the murder mystery, such as the main suspects, did not know that Helen had died. Therefore, they're not really acting like she had passed away. They're just acting as if she had disappeared. But even then, I'm kind of like, I thought you guys loved her. I don't really know why you're not so concerned about finding out what happened to her after so many years. But I also just didn't really feel like it's fair for a murderer. Like, I feel like I can buy into the argument that, like, yeah, Gwenda and Giles shouldn't think so much about the past, worry about their present. They have a new house, they're just newly remarried and all that stuff. I can understand that argument, but I feel like I don't want to just let a murderer get away scot-free. But you can definitely understand why Miss Marple doesn't want the couple to find out the truth, because she knows that if she found the murderer or understood the truth, Gwenda may not like the answer, because there is a strong opinion among our three sleuths that it was Gwenda's father who had killed Helen. So Miss Marple was just trying to protect Gwenda from the ugly truth. Or if it wasn't the father and the killer was still roaming free, then the killer would not hesitate to kill again or to hurt other people in order to keep his act a secret. As for the overall reading experience, even though I like the solution, I like the murderer, I like the everything, I wasn't really sold on investigations in regards to the other suspects. There were 3 men that our 3 sleuths suspected, all of whom had been in Helen's life before she died. And I just don't really feel like their motives for supposedly killing her were strong enough. Not a strong enough case has been presented to me to convince me that, like, yeah, one of these people could have done it. And I might have felt differently if I did not remember the killer already and therefore wasn't constantly anticipating the big reveal. But regardless, I just feel like there should still be enough evidence to kind of make it seem like any one of these 3 presented suspects could have done it. And going back to the final answer, the brothers' incestuous and kind of pedophilic motives were genuinely disturbing if you think about it for too long. And yet the solution is so simple in the way that Agatha Christie stories tend to be so simple, because so much of the story actually revolves around the brother and his relationship to Helen, and all clues really point to him. So in that way, it is a very good book. The premise is excellent, the execution is good, and there were genuinely parts of the book where I felt scared and at the edge of my seat, even though I already knew what was going to happen. So after I read that book, I moved on to the next one, which is The Moving Finger. This is the only book out of the 5 that I couldn't remember the ending of, so I was very excited. It's been a while since I came across an Agatha Christie book that I was not familiar with the plot of. Honestly, I really enjoyed this book. I listened to it like twice because I was so entertained by my first listen. The plot revolves around a brother and sister named Jerry and Joanna. Jerry was injured from a plane crash and was instructed by their doctor to live in the quiet country while they recovered, and he is accompanied by his younger sister Joanna. They are both renting a house in a village called Limstock and are slowly integrating themselves into the community when it is revealed that poison pen letters have actually been sent out to everyone who's living in the village prior to their arrival. The two siblings actually get a letter of their own. One of these poison pen letters caused the death of Mrs. Symington, who is the mother of our other protagonist, Megan Hunt. At some point, it is revealed that the culprit was actually Mr. Richard Symington, who was the husband of Mrs. Richard Symington and is Megan's stepfather. He was the one who sent out poison pen letters to divert people's attentions away from Mrs. Symington's death, and then he also killed the maid because she knew too much, and then tried to kill Megan at the book's climax. This is definitely my favorite Miss Marple book so far because it ticks off all of the right boxes for me. I figured out the murderer pretty easily early on, less because of the actual clues of the story and more so out of intuition and my ability to recognize patterns. The key in these types of stories is thinking of who is actually most likely to benefit from the death of Mrs. Symington. As far as plots go in the Agatha Christie oeuvre, it's pretty high up there in terms of premises and execution. The biggest thing I liked about the book, however, is the characters. Even though Jerry is our narrator, I think there are actually three main protagonists in the book: Jerry, Joanna, and Megan. The three of their relationships are always simmering in the background, and these three people are the ones who change the most at the end of the story. Jerry and Joanna have great banter as siblings. They're affectionate to each other, they recognize each other's flaws and weaknesses, and at the end of the day, they clearly want what's best for the other. Both of their respective romances are integral to the story, and they are actually two kinds of romantic tropes that I find frequently in Agatha Christie's novels. Joanna is a beautiful woman who is liked and admired by everyone and therefore could have anyone that she wanted. Instead, she chooses and falls in love with the competent, efficient, serious, nerdy character Dr. Owen Griffiths. This is a trope we also see in Dumb Witness with Teresa and Dr. Rex Donaldson. Meanwhile, Megan and Jerry actually kind of remind me of Conchita and Stephen in Hercule Poirot's Christmas. Both are couples who are playful with each other, who clearly enjoy each other's company, and the chemistry of their romance does not hinge upon the circumstances of the murder. Like, you really get the sense that if this nasty business did not occur, they would still get along and find their way to each other. Another thing I noticed was that Christie did not really follow up with her usual ideas about hereditary in this book. At the end, when Megan confronts her stepfather, she invokes her biological father and his inclination for unsavory actions. She's basically saying, well, my dad went to jail because he blackmailed people, and because I'm his daughter, that means I'm gonna blackmail you as well. And of course, the book doesn't really follow up on it. It's kind of the plan that Miss Marple has cooked up to kind of reveal Richard Symington's real motives. But this idea of the inheritance or the transference of evil within your bloodline is very prominent across a lot of her writing. So I just thought it was interesting that in this situation, she decided not to follow through with that. And it's not like she's super consistent about this kind of thing anyway. If you look at other books like Hercule Poirot's Christmas and even Murder on the Links, there's lots of instances where her views about how evil can be passed down, or like your inclination to be whatever can be passed down to your offspring, is not always consistent. But I wanted to point it out anyway. To sum it up, I really enjoyed this book. Like I said, it's my favorite Miss Marple story, which is not really hard to see why given the rest of the books that I'm about to talk about, but I'll get to that when I get to that. For now, we're gonna move on to the next book that I read, which is 450 from Paddington. A friend of Miss Marple named Mrs. McGillicuddy witnesses a murder through the window of her train, and the murder occurs on the end of the train as it is passing through Mrs. McGillicuddy's window. So it's like she saw a glimpse of the scene. She couldn't do anything about it because she's obviously in a different vehicle as it was running parallel. She tries to draw attention to what she saw, But even with Miss Marple's help, she fails. However, Miss Marple was at least able to figure out that if the murder did occur and the body was not found on the train, the best way to dispose of it would be to push it through the train's window and for the body to land in a specific glade or meadow that is right next to this private property, according to the map. Miss Marple, who is already quite old at this stage and therefore cannot pursue this mystery on her own, employs Lucy Elsbarrow to do all the physical sleuthing for her. Lucy successfully infiltrates the estate as a very efficient and very well-liked housekeeper. Lucy finds the body in the estate's barn, therefore proving Mrs. McGillicuddy's claims and Miss Marple's hunch correct. The rest of the story revolves around finding out who the dead woman is, which of the estate's family killed her, and why. I think this was a good book. It is a perfectly adequate and entertaining and sometimes genuinely funny murder mystery. While the solution makes sense, it did feel like it came out of nowhere, and I would have liked more clues kind of pointing towards Dr. Quimper as the culprit a little bit more frequently before the final reveal. Lucy was a very good protagonist. I liked her as a character, but I definitely did not fawn over her to the extent that the Krakenthorpe family did. And it definitely was necessary for everyone in the house to fall in love with her a little bit, just for the plot to chug along. I'm happy to overlook that for the sake of the story, but I would have liked it if there were just more instances of Lucy actually doing things that justified a lot of the praise and admiration she received from the other characters. As a side note, I did watch the BBC Miss Marple episode adaptation of this book, and for some reason, I think I actually liked the adaptation episode a little bit more than the original because of the adjustments that they made to fit the story for TV. First thing is that they actually made it a little bit clearer and more logical that Dr. Quimper was the murderer and did all of his things because he was in love with Emma Krakenthorpe, because in the original book he did all of that and killed the woman because he wanted to marry the Emma Krakenthorpe, the daughter, and so that eventually he would get the money later on, which felt like a very flimsy excuse to me. So to change it so that he was in love with her and was trying to get rid of his wife, and that's why he killed her, I think that just made a little bit more sense and just felt, I don't know, a little bit cleaner. The other change that I really liked in the episode was that what they did with the inspector character. There is a local policeman kind of involved in the original book, but we don't really get to know him very well, whereas the inspector character in the episode played a more prominent role for sure. Miss Marple usually lives in St. Mary Mead, and for this case, she travels to the town next to the family's estate to be closer to the scene of this crime and to be closer to Lucy so that they can communicate more easily. First, they introduce the inspector character as just a family friend that Miss Marple saw grow up into an adult, and he's introduced as basically someone that Miss Marple is currently using the hospitality of for this particular case. But then when the body is found, it's revealed that this guy is actually the inspector in charge of the entire investigation, which I just feel like is so much more interesting and was a very clever thing that they did. Very nicely done. I genuinely found this guy very charming and endearing, and I really loved that Lucy chose him, in the episode at least, over Brian Eastley, which is a member of the family, the Krakenthorpe family. Just as well, even in the book, I was like, why are you tying yourself to this family? Because in the book, there's a bunch of these young men who are kind of infatuated with her, right? By the end of the book, Lucy was deliberating between either Cedric Krakenthorpe or Brian Eastley. Honestly, I didn't like either of them in the book. So I was I'm really happy that she decided to just sever herself or untether herself from this family the minute the investigation was over. And also, I really like the inspector in this episode. And because of watching this episode, I do feel that it has actually highlighted all of the weaknesses of the original that I might have not otherwise excused, but because I saw a cleaner execution of the same story that kind of more or less stayed true to the plot's vibe and energy. Regardless, this was still a good read. The level of quality that I expect from Agatha Christie at this stage. After reading this book, I moved on to the next one, which is A Caribbean Mystery. Miss Marple is abroad on an all-expenses-paid trip by her nephew Raymond West. One of the tourists on the hotel resort that she's staying in, Major Palgrave, tells Miss Marple a story about a murderer and even offers to show her a photo of him. However, just as he is about to show her the photo, Major Palgrave sees something or someone in the distance, and he changes the subject and he puts the photograph away in his pocket. The next day, Major Palgrave dies, and Miss Marple suspects the worst and is proven correct when a second murder happens, this time one of the attendees of the hotel, who apparently knew something. All of this culminates in the end, where it's revealed that Tim Kendall, the hotel proprietor, was the murderer that Major Palgrave was talking about, and he had killed in the past and was trying to kill his current wife, Molly Kendall, for her money. He has also been drugging her for the past few weeks or days to make her think that she is kind of going through a psychotic episode, and his grand plan was basically to make it look like she was so upset and suicidal that he had just killed herself. I'm gonna be honest, I genuinely did not like this book. I was not a fan of it. This is one of those books where the ending was already spoiled for me because I had watched a old movie adaptation of the book. The mystery plot is just average. It's not the best, but it's still kind of well planned. Like, all the clues are still properly placed in its right position. I think the attempt at a diverse cast of characters was just that, an attempt. It wasn't really a good execution. I kind of had trouble keeping up who is who because there was like this wife and that husband were having an affair with each other. And I don't know, I feel like for a hotel, there should be more colorful or vibrant people involved. And I know that Agatha Christie can pull this off because she's done other kind of holiday-esque travel vibes settings before with Death in the Nile and Appointment with Death. And I don't know, I just felt like the character work could have been better. I didn't really care about anyone's problems aside from like finding out who did the killing and what the hell was going on with Molly Kendall. The setting wasn't fleshed out as well either. Maybe because I've gotten used to Agatha Christie making really good descriptions and location stories set in the Middle East or like in archaeological dig. Maybe she just hasn't really spent as much time in the location that she's picked for this book that it just really felt so paper thin. I feel like this could have happened anywhere and it wouldn't have made a difference. And because we were in Miss Marple's mind for this book, I just felt kind of fatigued by being in her mind. Her internal monologue was just us kind of going around in circles and not really kind of uncovering anything as we went along. So this was definitely one of the like duds for me in Agatha Christie's overall bibliography. This is the kind of book that I feel like I would genuinely dissuade people from reading. But of course, I could be wrong. I know some people have enjoyed this. The only thing that I actually liked about the book was the unlikely allyship between one of the characters, Mr. Raphael, and Miss Marple. He's like super grumpy and cranky and rude to Miss Marple, but also everybody else. So I just thought he was kind of an interesting character, which is actually such a good way to segue into the next book that I read, which is Nemesis. Mr. Raphael has passed away, and in his will, he instructs Miss Marple to solve a mystery for him, and if she succeeds, she gets £20,000 as a reward. She doesn't receive much more information from him in the beginning, but throughout the book, she gets guided into specific situations, and several people are placed in her trajectory to help her. The more she snoops, the more she discovers that there was a girl named Verity Hunt that Mr. Raphael's son, Michael, was engaged to, but she was murdered. And since Michael Raphael was a delinquent and was the only suspect, he was therefore charged with her murder and was sent to prison. Miss Marple eventually succeeds in solving the crime, and the real murderer was actually Verity's adopted family member. I'm a bit confused on that part. Overall, I felt very frustrated with this book. This is definitely like my least favorite, one of my least favorite Agatha Christie books for sure, ever. Not enough happens in the story, and it has the same vibe as A Caribbean Mystery. I think because both have been narrated by Miss Marple herself, that I'm like, I don't really enjoy being inside her head. I think because so far all of the books that I've enjoyed that feature her tend to be narrated by other people, and I find that I like those a lot more than these two that I've read where she's the narrator and we're inside her head. And I just kept getting bored by how little that happens. I wasn't a fan of the pacing, and there was also so many people to keep track of. The tourists, the hosts, the other allies that Miss Marple has to talk to. I just kept getting confused by who was who. This was also a really bizarre book in the sense that it became a conduit for Agatha Christie's ideas about rape, sexual assault, and the current youth's sexual appetite, as well as a very stark reminder of Agatha Christie's nasty classism and homophobia that was very typical for somebody who grew up in her time period, but it's just super jarring to read as a modern reader. And the fact that the quality of the book doesn't make up for that, as it tends to do sometimes. There's obviously lots of weird stuff in Agatha Christie books, but if the book is good enough, I'm usually willing to overlook it for the sake of the enjoyment or the entertainment that the book is able to provide. And in this situation, there's just not enough good to balance out the bad. I don't even have enough time to unpack all of the weird stuff that she decides to put in there. I do think that this was a very interesting premise and that could have been better handled or executed. For example, there were these really interesting themes that kept getting brought up about being old and just like ponderings about mortality, because not only did Mr. Raphael died, and obviously Miss Marple is solving a murder, so there's like other dead people involved, but there's also the sense of like time passing, because again, this is a murder of the past, but also Miss Marple herself is getting closer and closer to Mr. Raphael's state herself, and the people that she interacts with also tend to be older. But again, like, all of these ideas were just not executed well enough, or were just not coherent enough for me. Another gripe I have is that given the title of the book, I kind of expected the themes of Miss Marple being the Nemesis to be a lot stronger, a lot more prominent, and a lot clearer, especially since that is the key word that kind of ties Miss Marple and Mr. Raphael together. So I just felt like this was a big fumble on Agatha Christie's part, just very weak and forgettable. I did not enjoy this at all. And with that, that's all of the 5 books I read. Let's move on to the discussions for trying to make sense of all of the 5 that I've read. So now we've reached the end of the video. I'm going to try to find themes and tropes that I found consistent across the 5 books. Now, of course, I kind of chose these at random, and if you look at a kind of chronological order in the way that they've been written, maybe it'll be easier to kind of see a progression in how Agatha Christie has written Miss Marple, or how Miss Marple as a character has developed or evolved over time. Just a interesting point is that Nemesis is the last thing that Agatha Christie wrote for Miss Marple, whereas Sleeping Murder she had written a long time ago and then had just kept it safe until I think after her death. So this is the last Agatha Christie book that has been published that she has written. But interestingly enough, Sleeping Murder and Nemesis both feature a family member who was so obsessed with their love interest that they killed them. Helen in Sleeping Murder and Verity in Nemesis are both beautiful young women that their murderers could not bear to be parted with. And both books also technically deal with their murders set in the past, which I thought was quite interesting and is not really planned. I just thought that was kind of interesting that this is a story or a concept that Agatha Christie has been thinking about for a long time, that even though she wrote Sleeping Murder like decades before she wrote Nemesis, in a roundabout way, through destiny, they both kind of have similar elements that way. The Moving Finger and A Caribbean History features the husband as the killer, although their motives are entirely different, with The Moving Finger being one to Kill for Love, and a Caribbean mystery, One to Kill for Money. 3 out of the 5 books feature Miss Marple being tasked to be the sleuth. In The Moving Finger, the vicar's wife asks Miss Marple to come to Limstock to help with not just the poison pen letters, but also to figure out who the murderer had been. In 450 from Paddington, Mrs. McGillicuddy asks for her help specifically, and it's the same with Mr. Raphael in Nemesis, because they both know, actually all 3 of them know, Miss Marple's capabilities in regards to solving murders. Sleeping Murder and A Caribbean Mystery are ones where Miss Marple kind of just stumbles into the story. All 5 of them honestly have very interesting and very attention-grabbing premises, but the execution on nearly all of them were either just average or just downright not great. So my ranking of the 5 books is as follows. Again, this is just for the 5 that I've read and not in the entire Miss Marple bibliography. So my least favorites are Nemesis and A Caribbean History. I couldn't choose between one or the other. I found them both equally just dry and not entertaining reads. Like, I just didn't like the execution. In 3rd place, I like 450 from Paddington. I think it's just a very average Miss Marple story. It's at a standard of quality that I expect from Agatha Christie. The characters are fun, the mystery is tightly woven, and I wouldn't mind recommending it to other people. And then the second book that I liked the most was Sleeping Murder. I like Gwenda as a character, the plot was tightly constructed, and the ending was very thrilling. Like, it was like you were at the edge of your seat when it was revealed who the murderer was, and you're genuinely scared. Glad that this was the last book that was published under Agatha Christie, because if we had ended with Nemesis, I would have genuinely been like, no. And then lastly, my favorite out of the 5 is The Moving Finger. Yes, of course, for all of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. I just genuinely like it, and honestly, I like it so much that I would love to find a physical copy of it and keep it in my Agatha Christie collection, which I should do a video about because I'm quite proud of what I have, and it's just like a random assortment of Agatha Christie things, so keep an eye out for that in the future. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a like. If you want to see more of my work, subscribe. I am gonna try to pump out as many videos as I can. I have a lot of free time right now. And if you want to support me, you're welcome to check out my Patreon and Coffee pages down below. That's where my social media pages are as well if you want to follow me there. And I think that's it. I can't wait to share my love with you again next time. I'll see you soon. Bye!